is a country that grows enough food to feed 1 out of every 5 people alive. Not 1 in 5 of its own citizens, 1 in 5 human beings on the planet. It does this on a little under 1/10 of the world's farmland. Some of that farmland is poisoned, some of it is drying out, some of it is being paved over faster than it can be replaced. And the same country, within the memory of people still living, went through the deadliest famine in recorded history. Not centuries ago, in the lifetime of grandparents, tens of millions of people starved to death in 3 years. Both of these things are true at the same time. The nation that could not feed itself, that watched its own people die in the fields, is now the nation that feeds more mouths than any other in human history. It holds the largest store of grain on Earth, more than half the world's rice, more than half its wheat, locked in silos, held back, kept in reserve for a hunger its leaders swore would never come again. How does a place go from one to the other in a single lifetime? This is China, and this is the story of the hardest thing a civilization can do: keep its people fed. Start with the arithmetic, because the arithmetic is where the wonder is. China is roughly the same size as the United States. Draw one map over the other, and they nearly match. But only about 1/10 of China's land can grow a crop. The rest is mountain, desert, plateau, and ice. All of that usable farmland put together covers less ground than the state of Texas, and on it depend 4 times as many people as live in the whole United States. Split that farmland among them, and each person gets about 8/100ths of a hectare, a patch smaller than a tennis court, 6 times less than an American has, hundreds of times less than the space worked by the average American farm. On that patch, China grows more rice than any nation but one, more wheat than anyone, more pork, more apples, more potatoes, more farmed fish than any country on Earth. There is exactly one important crop it cannot grow enough of. But hold on to that, it comes later. And it does all of this on shrinking ground. Since the founding of modern China in 1949, the country has lost something like 1/5 of the farmland it started with, to cities, to roads, to erosion, to the sea. There is a phrase Chinese leaders return to again and again in speeches and in policy, that the rice bowl of the Chinese people must be held firmly in Chinese hands. It sounds like a slogan. It is closer to a wound. A country that remembers exactly what it feels like when the bowl is empty. Consider only what a single ordinary day demands. 1.4 billion people sitting down to eat 3 times over. The country harvests something over 650 million tons of grain in a year to meet it. And every morning, before the cities wake, rivers of vegetables and meat and fish move into the markets, the wet markets, where much of China still buys its food fresh each day, the greens and live fish and cuts of pork that were in a field or a pond a day before. A logistical act repeated every single day on a scale no other society has ever had to manage. And it has grown, most of it, on almost nothing. There is no endless prairie here, no American field running to the horizon under a single owner. China's food comes off hundreds of millions of tiny plots, the average farm the size of a large garden. A family working a patch you could cross in a minute by hand, the way their parents did. A fifth of humanity fed from garden-sized fields. To understand how the bowl gets filled, you have to go south, to water. In the middle of China, the Yangtze River runs for more than 6,000 kilometers from the ice of the Tibetan Plateau to the sea at Shanghai. It is the third longest river in the world, and along its banks, something began that would eventually feed half the planet: rice. Go back 11,000 years. The last ice age is loosening its grip. Along the middle Yangtze in the marshes of what is now Hunan and Hubei, people are pulling wild grass seeds from the water. The grass is a kind of rice, bitter, small, quick to scatter its grain the moment it ripens, the way wild plants do. Because a seed that clings to the stalk is a seed that never gets to grow. But some plants hold their seed a little longer, and the people notice. They gather from those plants first. They save that seed. They plant it. And slowly, over centuries they could never have counted, the rice changes. It stops scattering. It waits to be harvested. It becomes, without anyone deciding it, a crop. The evidence is still in the ground. Along the lower Yangtze, at a place called Himudu, archaeologists have dug up rice grains 7,000 years old, white when the soil is first opened, darkening to black in minutes as the air reaches them. Whole layers of husks and stalks and paddle-shaped bone tools, the refuse of harvests older than the pyramids. Rice does not grow like wheat. It grows in water. A flooded field drowns the weeds that would choke it and floats nutrients to its roots. So the farmers learn to flatten the land, to hold the water, to build low walls of mud that keep each field a perfect, shallow pond. Where the land is not flat, they make it flat. In the mountains of the south, whole hillsides are carved into steps. Terraces, stacked one above the other, curving with the shape of the slope. Some of these staircases of water are more than 2,000 years old. They were cut by hand, with iron tools and human backs, and they are still farmed today by the descendants of the people who cut them. From a distance in the morning, when the flooded steps catch the sky, a mountain can look like a broken mirror laid against the earth. In Yunnan, in the far southwest, one such system has been worked for more than 1,000 years by the Hani people. They read the whole mountain as a single machine. Forest on top to hold the clouds and gather the water. Villages beneath the forest. Terraces beneath the villages, fed by the water running down through them. And the river at the bottom, its mist rising back up to the forest to begin the cycle again. 13 centuries of hands have kept that wheel turning, and it turns still. This is the land where rice was born, and for thousands of years it drew people to it. Around the year 750, 3 out of 4 Chinese lived north of the Yangtze. 5 centuries later, 3 out of 4 lived south of it, pulled down into the rice country by a single change. A faster-growing rice brought from the kingdoms to the south that ripened quickly enough to grow 2 crops in a year instead of 1. Twice the harvest, twice the food, twice the people the land could hold. It is here, in Hunan, in these same wet fields, that a young man will one day walk out among the rice and see something no one else has noticed. But his story comes later. Hold on to him. There was always one problem the rice could not solve. The great harvests were in the south, but the capitals, the emperors, the armies, the cities of officials were in the north, and the north could not always feed itself. So China dug a river to move the food. The Grand Canal runs for more than 1,700 kilometers, joining the rice country of the south to the northern plains. Parts of it are more than 2,000 years old. The whole system was linked together over 1,000 years ago. It is the longest artificial waterway ever built by human beings. For century after century, barges of southern rice moved up that canal to the northern capital. Tribute grain, hundreds of thousands of tons of it a year, floated north on a hand-dug river, because the people who ran the country lived where the food would not grow. The problem is old then. The food is in one place, the mouths are in another, and the whole story of feeding China is, in part, the story of moving the one to meet the other.
Follow the food west,
and the land folds itself into a great bowl ringed by mountains. This is Sichuan, and it is one of the most fertile places in the country. The mountains trap warm, wet air. The rivers lay down rich soil. Fog sits in the basin for much of the year, soft and grey, so that the sun is a rumour and the green is everywhere. Land this good feeds people, and people gather where the food is. Tens of millions of them live in the Sichuan Basin, packed into one of the densest rural landscapes on the planet. And where there are that many people in China, there are pigs. No animal matters more to the Chinese table than the pig. Pork is not a luxury here. It is the center of the plate, the thing a meal is built around. And China raises more pigs than the rest of the world combined. Hundreds of millions of them, roughly half of every pig alive. A single province, Sichuan, has at times held 50 million. More pigs in one Chinese province than there are people in most countries. The pig is efficient. It eats what people cannot, scraps, grain, the leftovers of the harvest, and turns it back into food. For thousands of years, in a country with almost no land to spare, that made the pig the perfect partner. Nothing wasted, everything returned to the bowl. But a herd that size is fragile. In 2018, a disease called African swine fever swept across China and killed a staggering share of its pigs. By some counts, close to half the national herd, hundreds of millions of animals, dead or slaughtered to stop the spread. Pork prices doubled. The country that had conquered hunger suddenly could not keep meat on the table. China's answer was the same answer it gives to everything about food. Never depend on luck again. It rebuilt the herd, and quietly it keeps a national reserve of pork, frozen, stockpiled, released when prices climb. A strategic store of meat, the way other countries keep a store of oil. And it went further than that. On the banks of the Yangtze, near the city of Aizhou, China built something that has no equal anywhere on Earth. A skyscraper for pigs. It stands 26 stories tall, as high as the tower that holds Big Ben. From the outside, it looks like an apartment block, the kind that lines every Chinese city. Inside, it is a farm stacked on top of itself, floor after floor. Feed rides a conveyor to the top into giant tanks and drops down through the building to troughs that release it by weight, by age, by the exact needs of each animal on each floor. More than 1 million pounds of feed a day. Pregnant sows on one level, nursing piglets on another, fattening hogs above. And in a control room, in uniforms, technicians watch it all on high-definition screens, a command center for meat, glowing like the deck of a spacecraft. It is not without risk. Pack 100,000 animals under one roof, and a single sickness can move through all of them in days. The very thing that makes the tower efficient makes it dangerous. But the logic that built it is the logic that runs the whole country. Get more from less. Stack the harvest toward the sky when there is no more ground to spread it on. It is a strange thing to stand in the country where the pig was first tamed, 10,000 years ago in these same river valleys, and look up at a tower where its descendants live and die on floors above the earth. The rivers give more than land for pigs. They give the water itself. China takes about a third of all the fish caught or raised on Earth, and more than half of that does not come from the ocean at all. It comes from ponds, from flooded fields, from lakes and canals, and the slow green backwaters of the Yangtze and the Pearl River deltas. The Chinese were among the first people anywhere to farm fish, raising carp in the same paddies that grow their rice, so that a single flooded field produces two harvests at once. Grain above, fish below. The fish eat the pests and stir the water. Their waste feeds the rice, and nothing is lost, because in a country this crowded, waste is a kind of madness no one can afford. And when the ponds and the paddies are not enough, China goes to the sea. Its fishing fleet is the largest on Earth by far. Thousands of vessels that range across every ocean, staying out for months at a time, hauling protein back from waters on the far side of the world. A country that cannot grow enough on its own land reaches quietly all the way across the globe for the rest. Everywhere you look in China, the same instinct repeats. Get more from less. Fold one use of the land into another. Feed the many on the little that there is. And not all of what the land gives is food. On the hills of the southeast, where the slopes are too steep and the soil too thin for grain, the Chinese grow tea. Terraced gardens of low green bushes, clipped flat, following the contour of the land. It was here, thousands of years ago, that people first learned to dry and steep the leaf. And tea became one of the things China gave the world. And in the mulberry groves, China raised an insect. The silkworm is not wild. It cannot fly, cannot survive on its own. Thousands of years of breeding have left it entirely dependent on human hands. It eats only mulberry leaves, and when it is ready, it spins itself a cocoon from a single unbroken thread, a thread that can run more than a kilometre long. Unwind that thread from cocoon after cocoon, and you have silk. For centuries, China alone knew the secret and guarded it, and grew rich on it. The road that carried that silk west, across deserts and mountains, all the way to Rome, is the reason we still say the words Silk Road. And along that same road, moving the other way, came the seeds of the wheat that now feeds the northern plains. But the insect that made China rich was not the only one that mattered. There was another. For as long as there had been fields, there had been the locust, rising in swarms out of the dry ground in the bad years, blackening the sky, coming down on the ripe grain and stripping a whole season to nothing in an afternoon. In the old records, locust plagues and famine are written down side by side, again and again. The same small animal, century after century, standing between the harvest and the mouth. But the land is not only farmed. In the folds of the mountains, in the places too steep or too high or too cold for a crop, China holds some of the strangest life on Earth. High in the bamboo forests of the West, in Sichuan and Shanxi and Gansu, lives the animal the whole world knows, the giant panda. It is a bear. Its body is built to eat meat. But somewhere in its past, it made a choice that makes no sense. It gave up meat for bamboo, the poorest food in the forest. Bamboo holds so little nourishment that the panda has to eat for as much as 14 hours a day, working through 40 pounds of it just to stay alive. There were once perhaps only 1,000 of them left in the wild. The forests were falling, the bamboo was being cleared. The animal that had survived for millions of years looked, for a moment, like it would not survive the century. And then it did. Nurseries were built, forests were protected and stitched back together. Slowly, the numbers climbed, past 1,200, past 1,500, toward 2,000. In 2016, the panda was quietly moved off the list of endangered species, still fragile, still watched, but no longer falling. It is not alone up there. In the same high forests lives the golden snub-nosed monkey, its face a startling blue, its fur the color of dry straw. It survives at 3,000 meters and above, in cold that drops to 30 below, eating lichen scraped off the bark of trees when nothing else will grow. And in the cold rivers, hidden under stones, lives the largest amphibian on the planet, the Chinese giant salamander. It can grow to the length of a tall man. It can live more than 60 years. It has changed so little over so long that biologists call it a living fossil, a creature swimming in the present with a body from 170 million years ago. Not everything in these waters survived. The Yangtze once held its own river dolphin, the baiji, pale and nearly blind, navigating the muddy current by sound. It had lived in the river for 20 million years. In 2006, after decades of fishing and damming and traffic on the water, scientists went looking for it and could not find a single one. They declared it functionally extinct. The first large animal in generations driven out of existence by human hands. A country this crowded is always quietly making that trade. What it saves, what it loses, what it can afford to keep. And where nothing can be farmed at all, China still finds a way to eat. On the Tibetan plateau, the highest land on Earth, where the air is thin and the growing season lasts a matter of weeks, the crops give out. But the yak does not. Shaggy, broad-lunged, built for the cold and the altitude, it turns the tough grass of the high meadows into milk, butter, meat, wool, and fuel. For the herders of the plateau, the yak is very nearly everything, and the one grain that will ripen up here, barley, is roasted, ground, and mixed with yak butter and tea into tsampa, the food that has kept people alive on the roof of the world for a very long time. Leave the south now. Cross the country to the north, and the land itself changes underfoot. Here the rivers run yellow. The North China Plain is built on loess, a fine, pale, wind-blown dust, piled up over hundreds of thousands of years until it is, in places, hundreds of meters deep. It is soft, it crumbles in the hand, and it is astonishingly fertile. This is wheat country, and millet, and corn. North of the old dividing line of the Huai River, the flooded rice fields give way to dry, dun-colored plains that stretch flat to the horizon, cut into squares of grain. The food changes with the land. Where the south eats rice, the north eats wheat. Noodles pulled by hand, bread steamed instead of baked, dumplings folded shut around the winter. Two cuisines, two ways of eating, divided by a river, both of them 1,000 years deep. In the northwest, a cook takes a single lump of dough and stretches it in the air, folding and pulling, until one piece becomes two, then four, then a bowl of noodles finer than string. In the northeast, whole families gather at the table through the frozen months to fold dumplings by the hundred, sealing a little of the harvest inside each pleated shell. The grain is the same wheat everywhere. What each region learned to do with it is 1,000 years of its own history. But the river that made the northern plain is also the river that has destroyed it again and again. The Chinese call the Yellow River China's sorrow. It carries so much of that fine, loose soil that its own bed rises as the silt settles, until the river runs higher than the fields around it, held back only by walls of earth. When those walls fail, the river does not simply flood. It leaves its channel entirely and carves a new path to the sea, drowning everything in between. It has done this more than 1,000 times in recorded history. Its great floods are among the deadliest disasters humanity has ever recorded. The flood of 1887 is thought to have killed close to 1 million people. The flood of 1931, more still. To farm this plain has always meant to gamble against the water. And still, for 4,000 years, the people stayed. Because the loess, when it does not drown you, grows grain like almost nowhere else. The country cannot afford to lose that ground. So in 2006, China's leaders draw a line no official is allowed to cross. The nation must never hold less than 120 million hectares of farmland. In Chinese measure, 1.8 billion mu. It is written into the national plans. It is repeated in speech after speech. Officials who let farmland fall below the line in their district are told they will answer for it, not just now, but for the rest of their lives.
It is an extraordinary thing to make into law.
A flaw beneath the soil, a promise that no matter what the country builds, no matter how the cities spread, this much ground will always be kept for food. The cities test that promise every single day. China's farmland shrank by more than 12 million hectares in barely a decade, swallowed by roads and factories and the endless growth of the megacities. Shanghai spreads outward across the same delta where rice was first planted. The country is, in a real sense, racing itself, building on the land it needs to farm. To make up for what the cities take, China turned to the far north, to a place that, within living memory, no one farmed at all. In the extreme northeast, where the country's border presses against Russia, lies a vast, cold plain built on black soil, earth so dark and heavy with old organic matter that it feels almost oily in the hand, laid down over 10,000 years and in places a full meter deep. There are only 4 great black soil regions on Earth. This is one of them. For most of its history, it was wilderness, marsh and reed and frozen wetland, empty of farms, too cold and too wet and too remote to bother with. The Chinese called it Beida Huang, the Great Northern Wilderness. In the 1950s, the country sent it an army. Hundreds of thousands of demobilized soldiers and young volunteers went north at the national call to break the wilderness open. They drained the marshes, they turned the black earth, they built enormous, mechanized state farms across a stretch of land larger than many countries. And the wilderness became a warehouse. Beida Huang, the Great Northern Wilderness, became Beida Kang, the Great Northern Granary. Today, it is the single largest grain-producing region in the country, worked not by hand, but by fleets of combines, and by drones that map and spray the fields from the air, guided by satellite to the width of a hand. It grows enough, on its own, to feed close to a tenth of China. It was not free. The marshes that were drained held China's largest concentration of freshwater wetland and the life that lived on it. In recent years, some of that land has been deliberately let go, flooded again, returned to marsh. A country that spent decades turning wilderness into food, quietly buying a little of the wilderness back. The northern grain still had one enemy the black soil could not fix: water. China's farmland is mostly in the dry north. Its water is mostly in the wet south. Beijing and the Great Wheat Plains sit in a region with less water per person than parts of the Middle East. And a growing country, with growing cities and growing thirst, was slowly draining the north dry. So China did something almost no other nation would attempt. It decided to move the rivers. The south to north water diversion is the largest water transfer project ever built. Across 3 enormous routes, eastern, central, and western, it lifts water out of the wet Yangtze basin and carries it hundreds of kilometers north, through canals and tunnels and aqueducts, into the thirsty plains and the capital itself. It cost tens of billions of dollars. It reshaped the physical geography of the country. And its purpose, underneath everything, is the oldest purpose there is: to keep the fields wet and the grain growing and the bowl full. Out on the far western edge in Xinjiang, China farms the desert itself. The land here is dry beyond dry, basin and dune and salt flat, ringed by mountains that wring the rain from the sky before it can arrive. And yet, this is where China grows most of its cotton and orchards of fruit, on water squeezed from mountain snowmelt and delivered drop by drop straight to the root, so that almost none of it is lost to the sun. Not far from there lies a plateau so eroded, so stripped by centuries of grazing and plowing, that it became one of the most damaged landscapes on the planet. Bare hills bleeding their pale soil into the rivers with every rain. And China set out to reverse it. It banned the free grazing of goats and sheep across whole regions. It cut fresh terraces into the ruined slopes and built thousands of small dams to catch the running soil. Slowly, on land people had all but given up on, the green began to come back. And it is not only the frontiers that were pushed. In the crowded east, China learned to grow food where there was, by any ordinary reckoning, no room for it. In Shandong, on the northern plain, a quiet revolution happened under plastic. Simple greenhouses, a low wall of earth, a sheet of film stretched over a frame, warmed by nothing but the sun, let farmers grow vegetables straight through the freezing northern winter when the fields outside stood bare. Millions of these plastic tunnels now cover the countryside, turning single villages into year-round gardens. In the cities, the same instinct shows itself smaller. Vegetables climb the embankments beside the roads. They fill the odd triangles of land where streets meet. They grow up walls, in buckets, on rooftops, anywhere a person can put a handful of soil. In a country with this many mouths and this little land, an empty patch of dirt starts to look like a kind of waste no one is willing to allow. And behind all of it now runs something new. China spends more on farming science than any other single country on Earth. Billions of dollars a year poured into seed, into machines, into the strange new tools of a very old problem. Robots move down the rows. Laboratories edit the genes of crops to stand the drought and the salt and the heat that are coming. And across the country, seed banks store the old varieties, thousands of kinds of rice, the raw genetic material of every harvest still to be grown, frozen against the day they might be needed. But the newest problem is not in the soil, it is in the people. The young are leaving the land. They are going to the cities, to the factories and the offices, and they are not coming back to farm. The average Chinese farmer is aging, and the fields their parents fought to open are, in places, going quiet for want of hands to work them. A country can move a river. It can raise a tower for pigs and drain a wilderness for grain. It is much harder to make a young person want to stay and grow rice. And as China grew richer, what it grew began to change. A people that had lived for millennia on rice and wheat and millet started, as they climbed out of poverty, to want meat, pork, chicken, eggs, fish, in quantities their grandparents could not have imagined. But an animal is an inefficient way to make a meal. It takes many kilos of grain to make a single kilo of meat. And so, to feed the animals that fed the newly prosperous, China turned to corn. Corn here is barely food at all, not directly, it is feed. And China now grows more of it than any country but the United States. Vast seas of it across the north and northeast, almost all of it bound for a trough rather than a table. The richer the country becomes, the more grain it must grow simply to turn into meat. And there is one thing still that all of it cannot do. There is one crop China cannot grow enough of, no matter how hard it tries. The soybean. China grows almost everything it eats. In grain, it is about 95% self-sufficient. It feeds itself, from itself, to a degree that would be the envy of most of the world. But the soybean needs more land than China can spare. And China needs more soybeans than almost anyone to feed the pigs and the fish and the fowl that feed the people. As the country grew richer and ate more meat, that hunger only grew. So it buys them. China imports around 85% of the soybeans it uses. Most of them come from farms across the ocean, in the United States and in Brazil. It is the single thread in the whole vast system that runs off foreign soil, the one part of the bowl that another country's hands are helping to hold. And in a tense world, everyone in Beijing knows exactly how much that thread could cost. Which brings us back to a prediction. In the 1990s, as China's cities were beginning their great climb, a researcher in the West named Lester Brown looked at all of this: the shrinking land, the thirsty north, the billion-plus mouths, and wrote a book with a question for a title. Who will feed China? His answer was grim. China, he argued, was on a path it could not sustain. It would not grow enough. It would have to buy so much grain from the rest of the world that it would drain the global supply and drive the price of food beyond the reach of the poor everywhere. A hungry China, he warned, would become the whole world's problem. It was a serious warning from a serious man, and much of the world believed it. To understand why he was wrong, and to understand why China would move rivers and stack pigs toward the sky, rather than let him be right, you have to go back to the fields of Hunan, and to the young man we left standing in them. His name is Yuan Longping. He is born in 1930 into a China at war, and he grows up wanting to work with plants. In the 1950s, he is sent to teach at a small agricultural school in the Hunan countryside, a place so obscure he can barely find it on a map. And then the famine comes. In 1958, the country's leaders launch a campaign to leap forward, to catch the industrial nations in a matter of years. Farmers are pulled off the land to make steel in backyard furnaces. Grain ripens in the fields with no one left to harvest it. Local officials, terrified to report failure, claim harvests that do not exist. And the state collects grain against those false numbers, taking food that was never really there, leaving the villagers with nothing, in some places continuing to ship grain out while the people who grew it starve. Then the weather turns, and the harvest, already gutted, collapses. Between 1959 and 1961, across the Chinese countryside, people begin to starve. They strip the bark from the trees, they boil grass and roots, they eat the seed grain meant for the next planting, and then there is no next planting. In the worst-hit counties, 1 person in 5 dies. The government's own figures show the country's population falling by nearly 15 million in the space of 2 years. Most careful estimates put the dead somewhere between 30 and 45 million. It is the deadliest famine in the recorded history of the human race, and it was, above all, made by people, by policy, by men who would not look at what was in front of them. Yuan Longping looks at what is in front of him. He walks out from his school one day and finds on the roadside, at the edge of the fields, the bodies of people who have starved to death. He never forgets it. He will say, for the rest of his life, that the memory of that hunger set the course of everything he did. In 1961, out in the fields around his school, he finds a single stalk of rice standing taller than all the others, heavier, fuller. A natural accident, a plant that had by chance crossed with another and come out stronger than either parent. Most people would have eaten it. Yuan saves its seed. What he is chasing is something scientists had managed with corn and with wheat, but that nearly everyone believed was impossible with rice. Cross 2 different parent strains, and the offspring can come out stronger, taller, heavier with grain than either one alone. More food from the same field, the same water, the same work. Rice fights this. It pollinates itself. It does not want to be crossed. For years, Yuan and the handful of students he gathers around him comb the wild rice of the south for the rare, sterile plants that would make a cross possible, checking by hand tens of thousands of flowering heads season after season, chasing the sun south to Hunan in the winters, so they never lose a growing month. And in 1973, he does it, the first hybrid rice. The numbers changed the country. In the 1970s, a Chinese field might yield around 300 kilos of rice for every mu of land. With hybrid rice, that figure climbs, past 600 and eventually past 900, 2 and 3 times the food from the very same ground. That grain did not stay in China. Yuan's hybrid rice spread across Asia and into Africa, onto land that had never grown enough. When the world counts the scientists who kept the 20th century from starving, his name belongs near the top. A farmer's problem solved by a farmer's son. China made him a national hero. He carried the Olympic torch through the streets when the Games came to Beijing in 2008. He was given the country's highest honor, and when he died in 2021 at the age of 90, the crowds poured into the streets of Changsha in the rain, thousands of them following the car that carried him, laying flowers at the edges of his rice fields. They were not mourning a scientist exactly. They were mourning the man who had stood between them and a hunger their grandparents still remembered. But seed alone does not fill a country's bowl. The other half of the answer was not a plant at all. It was a decision about who owns the field. In the famine years, the land had belonged to no one and everyone, farmed in vast collective communes where a family's labor fed the group rather than the household, and where there was little reason to break your back on soil that was not yours. Then, at the end of the 1970s, China quietly let that go. It handed the land back to families to work on their own account, to grow what the state required, and then to keep or sell whatever more they could coax from the ground. The change ran through the countryside like current through a wire. Given a reason to grow more, the farmers grew more. Harvests climbed year after year. Hundreds of millions of people lifted themselves clear of hunger inside a single generation, one of the fastest retreats of poverty the world has ever seen. Not from a new machine, from a new answer to the oldest question in farming. Whose harvest is this? This is the answer to Lester Brown's question. Who will feed China? China decided that it would, not with one miracle, but with all of them at once. The hybrid seed, the moved rivers, the guarded farmland, the stacked towers of pigs, the fish in the rice paddies, the black soil granary in the north, the red line no one may cross. And it built one thing more, a wall against the memory itself. Across the country, in strategic silos, China holds the largest reserve of grain on the planet. By some estimates, it stores well over half the world's rice and wheat, and most of its corn. Not to sell, not to trade, but to sit there, held back, a buffer against a bad harvest, a closed border, a war, a return of the thing that happened within living memory. The first major policy document China's leaders release every single year before anything else is about agriculture, not industry, not technology. Food. A country that starved once and swore it would keep enough grain in the barn that it could never happen again. Hold the bowl firmly in your own hands. Now you can hear where the phrase comes from. It is not pride. It is the vow of someone who has gone hungry and cannot bear to trust anyone else with the next meal. And you can see what all of it is for, once a year, in the deep of winter. As the Lunar New Year comes, China empties its cities. Hundreds of millions of people, factory workers, students, drivers, clerks, pack the trains and the roads and the airports and go home. It is the largest movement of human beings that happens anywhere on Earth, and it happens for one reason: to sit down with family at a table, and at the center of that table is food. Dumplings folded shut in the north, a whole fish whose name in Chinese sounds like the word for surplus, for having more than enough, set out on purpose so that some is left uneaten, a wish for a year that does not run short. A whole civilization's memory of hunger folded into a single meal that says, "This year there is plenty. This year we are together, and there is enough." And a country that remembers hunger does not take a full plate lightly. In recent years, China has made a public cause of it. Campaigns against food waste, pressure on restaurants and diners to order only what they will finish. A whole society reminded from the very top not to throw away what so many once died for the want of. To waste food in a place with this memory is treated as something close to a moral failure. So the bowl is full, fuller than it has ever been, for more people than any country has ever fed. But look down at what it rests on. 40% of China's land is degrading, thinned, salted, worn out. To force so much grain from so little ground, China poured on fertilizer, at times 3 times as heavily per field as farms in America or Europe. It lifted the harvest and it wounded the soil, running off into the rivers, hollowing out the very earth it was meant to feed. The country has begun lately to pull back, to cap the chemicals, to try to heal the ground. But the damage of decades does not undo itself in a few years. The water is short, about a quarter of what the world holds per person, and much of it polluted. The farmland keeps shrinking under the weight of the cities. The soybean still comes across the sea, and the climate is turning against the very harvests the whole system leans on. Floods where there was rain, drought where there was none. Think back to the panda in its forest, spending 14 hours of every day just feeding itself, so bound to its single food that a shortage of bamboo could end it. It is easy to feel sorry for an animal so trapped by its own stomach. But there is something of the panda in the whole enterprise, a nation of 1.4 billion spending an enormous share of its effort, its water, its science, its land, and its law simply to keep eating. Bound to the harvest as tightly as the bear is bound to the bamboo. China has done the hardest thing a civilization can do. It has fed 1/5 of humanity on a fraction of the earth, and it has done it in the span of one lifetime, climbing out of the worst famine the world has ever seen. Whether it can keep doing it, on thinning soil, with shrinking water, as the cities rise and the climate shifts, no one can honestly say. The bowl is held. The hands are steady, for now, but the ground beneath the harvest is not as deep as it looks, and everyone who plans this country's future knows it. Thank you for spending this time with us, here in the country that turned the oldest fear there is into the largest feeding of human beings that has ever happened. If you'd like to keep traveling with us to the places behind the numbers, subscribe and stay a while. Until the next journey.